Over the next couple videos, we're going to work on the functionality to show our little avatars under each location in our location list view. Now, this is going to be a bit of an interesting section because admittedly, I didn't find a great, nice, clean way to implement this. So much so that I almost didn't include this feature in the app. Because, when you're in tutorial land or course world, like a lot of the examples are nice, neat, and contrived, very clean answers. And to be honest with you, that's not how the real world is. But we got to teach that way because if you start teaching these contrived, hacky like workarounds, that becomes very confusing. But because this was an intermediate course, I thought this was a great time to start talking about some of those decisions. And this is a good example of where I assessed multiple different solutions. None of them were great. None of them were super clean. And I had to pick the one that I thought was best, even though it wasn't perfect, to get this functionality working. So let's talk about some of the solutions I considered. We'll talk about the pros and cons of them. And then I'll tell you why I chose the one I did. But before we do that, if you want a little mini challenge, and the mini challenge isn't to build or code it, right? Just think about possible solutions. That's the challenge. Don't go off building anything. But maybe pause the video and think about how you would potentially solve this problem and then see how your solutions, stack up against the possible ones that I considered. Okay, so think about how you would do that. And a key thing to remember is that we're using back pointers that we've discussed a couple times where our profile has the reference to the location. Remember, we use this in the location detail view to show our grid of faces. So you can't just go query the locations and see who's checked in. You got to query the users. So that's the little spin on it. And again, the reason why we did that, if that seems backwards, seems like more work. If you have an array of checked in users on the location, that creates all kinds of conflicts. Again, I think this is the third time I've talked about this now. I'll link to the WWDC best practices video. Go check that out to hear more about that. So here's your last chance. Pause the video if you want to take a few minutes to think about it. We're going to go talk about my solutions right now. Okay, so when I'm thinking about this kind of stuff, I usually start at the most rudimentary, basic, brute force, not efficient way, right? I like to solve the problem first, make sure I can do it, and then think of ways to optimize it. So just, put that out there. That's the process my brain goes through. Okay, so my very first rudimentary thought was, all right, we have 8 locations and I already have a network call to get checked in users to the location, right? Again, that's what we're using for this location detail screen. We're already using that. So I was like, okay, I can reuse that, make 8 concurrent network calls on a background thread. Each network call, I'll plug in the location, find out who's checked into that location, and then I can return that for that location. Well, this has a few problems, right? So it might not be that bad when we have 8 locations. And again, a lot of these decisions need to be product specific. That's why there's a lot of discussion around this because it's not going to be a one size fits all answer. It's going to be unique to your product. Well, our product only has 8 locations. Well, it's not out of the question that maybe we want to expand on our locations. So having something like 10 to 20 locations, probably not unreasonable. We're not going to have 200 locations. Remember, our product is a highly curated product, so we know we're not going to go that far off. But still, even 10 to 20 network calls on a background thread, that's also 10 to 20 full queries of our profiles. Not super efficient, doesn't scale the best. It'll get the job done, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be the most efficient solution. And a big reason for that, which kind of leads into the next solution I thought of, was because, if I do have 20 locations, I don't want to do all that work up front because as you see on the table view, I'm only showing the first 6 locations, in our table view. So that's a lot of unnecessary work, getting locations 6 through 20 if I'm only showing this. So the next thought, I was like, okay, instead of one big chunk of work on load, why don't I put the network call in the cell? And then as the cell appears, make a network call from that cell because the cell is a specific location. So I can make that same network call I'm using where I plug in the location, get whoever's checked in and show that. Okay, that's a little better. That helps scale with the number of locations, right? Because we're only making the network calls for whatever locations are showing on our list view. However, as you know, people can scroll super fast and now we're firing off a ton of network calls. It's a lot of work being put on our database because remember, every network call has to query our entire list of profiles to see who's, checked in. And if we have 10,000 profiles, doing that every time a cell comes on screen, it's a lot of work. Again, doesn't scale. So this did solve the problem of doing all the work up front for all the locations. However, we still have that big problem of constantly querying our entire list of profiles, which we probably don't want to do. So as I was considering those two solutions, I noticed the common problem, right? The common problem is querying our entire database of DDG profiles for every location every time. It's a lot of excess work we don't want to do. So then my mind shifted to, okay, the main problem I'm seeing is I'm querying my profiles too much. How can I query my profiles once and get all the checked in locations, right? So my idea then turned to building a dictionary, right? Where in the dictionary, the key value pair, the key would be the record ID for my location, right? So Chipotle would have one, Original Joe's would have one, etc. And then the value at that key would be an array of DDG profiles that are checked in. So the thought process is query all the DDG profiles as I'm going through them, build a dictionary accordingly. And when I originally had this idea, I was like, oh, great, that's it. Awesome solution, problem solved. However, limitations in CloudKit made this a little sketchy. It's still a better solution than the first two, but there's some hacky little workarounds you had to do, and this is the trade-offs of this solution. Remember, like I said, I didn't think any of the solutions were great, but as you're gonna see, this is the one we picked, spoiler alert, because the trade-offs to this one aren't as bad as the other ones. The main downside to this one is that you can't filter for nils in the CloudKit predicate, because CloudKit only uses a subset of NS predicate, it doesn't use the whole thing, because in NS predicate, you normally can filter out the nils, but CloudKit, for some reason, you can't. The reason we'd want to filter out the nils for is checked in is because, right, say we have 10,000 DDG profiles, well, not all 10,000 profiles are going to be checked in somewhere. So when I'm getting all the record backs of people checked in, just ignore the nils. Don't send me all the records and then I have to filter the nils on the client side. That's a lot of excess work. I want to filter for the nils before you even send me the results, CloudKit, right? Because maybe only 30% of my users are checked in, right? That filters out a lot of records that I don't have to get back. So if CloudKit allowed me to do that, I would think this is a pretty good solution. I'd be happy with it. But the little hacky workaround makes me not happy with it. So I can get around this nil check. And the way to do that is to have a secondary property, again, told you it was hacky, on our DDG profile. And we'll call it something like the is checked in nil check, and it'll be a Boolean. Another weird thing about CloudKit, it doesn't have Booleans, so you have to use a 1 or a 0 as an int. So for this solution, we would have to have another property on our DDG profile called is checked in nil check, and it would equal 1 if they're checked in. If they're not checked in, it's nil, it's fine. So that property is what we're going to query. Now the downside to this, maybe you're following along, is that now we have to keep this is checked in nil check in sync with our is checked in property. Remember, because the is checked in property is a reference to whatever location we're checked into. So if that's nil, our is checked in nil check needs to be nil. If our reference on is checked in has a location there, then our is checked in nil check has to be a 1. Again, hacky workaround. This is the downside. This is why I didn't love it. Like I said, there was no clean, perfect solution. Because anytime you have to keep two properties in sync, you just open yourself up to a lot of errors. Now, luckily for our product, there's only two places where we're updating the checked in status, right? Our profile view and our location detail view. So just two areas to keep in sync, not too bad. But if you did have a product where you could update the checked out status from 8 different screens and you have to keep all that in sync, maybe I wouldn't do this. So again, a lot of these decisions are product specific. It's not a blanket answer. The other downside to this is that this upfront network call that we're going to do where we build this dictionary could end up having a lot of data. I don't know, let's say we have 10,000 users and we have 3,000 users checked into various locations during WWDC, right? It's a popular time. A lot of developers are there. So now we're pulling in 3,000 records on launch of this screen, essentially. Now, luckily, our records are very data minimal. We're not pulling in 3,000 high-res images. So we should be able to scale okay. But on that note of scaling, well, first of all, like I said, spoiler alert, this is the decision I went with building this dictionary. I felt the downsides were less than constantly querying our entire database of DDG profiles for every location, right? So that's why I went with this. But back on that note of scaling and figuring things out for the stage that your product is in. And what I mean by that, I'm assuming, if you're building this product, you're an indie developer, or maybe you're working at a small startup where solving for scaling, it's a constant balancing act. Because of course you don't want to do a super hacky solution that doesn't scale at all, right? Because that's not good. You do want to future-proof a little bit. However, if you spend all your time optimizing for millions and millions of users when you haven't even launched your product yet, your priorities are messed up. So remember, software is never finished. So the way I look at this, because I've spent my whole career building MVPs for early stage startups, just launching. And that's the key. You have to launch. You have to ship. If you're spending all your time optimizing for millions and millions of users when you haven't even shipped yet, you got things backwards, right? Because that takes a lot of time to optimize for all that. So the constant balance and the art of this like decision making, and why I wanted to talk about this, is the constant balancing act of doing enough to solve my problem right now, to not totally screw myself in the future, but also like I'll handle those problems in the future, right? There's a concept in development called premature optimization, and that can really come back to bite you because you can drive yourself nuts doing that, right? If you constantly say, well, what if we want to support 100 locations? What if we want to do this? What if we want to do that? And then you try to future-proof and handle all those situations, your life's going to be a nightmare and you're never going to ship. So again, be wary of premature optimization. But again, it's a balancing act. You don't want to go too far the other way where your app can't scale past 100 users, right? Because that's bad too. But like I said, that is the art of programming, making these types of decisions. That's why I decided to actually put this maybe hacky little functionality in the course to kind of have a chance to discuss this. And quite honestly, the way you get good at this is just time and experience. If you're a junior developer, you haven't really experienced this yet, you're just starting out, just the honest truth is how you're gonna learn is you're gonna mess this up. And that you're going to learn it the hard way. Just point blank, I'm giving you the advice, but the only way you're going to learn is to mess it up yourself. And that's what all of the senior developers you know have done. Anytime you look at a senior developer and you're like, oh man, they're so smart, how'd they know that right away? I guarantee you it's because they've messed it up in the past and they learned the hard way. Like that's how they got so wise. But anyway, that's the decision we went with. We're gonna go the dictionary route. I think this would be a great chance for discussion in the comments because look, I may have missed something. Maybe you came up with a better solution. These are the types of discussions you would have in a team. If you're working on a team of developers, you would go to your senior developer, say, hey, I'm having trouble finding a good solution for this. I've tried this, this, and this. Here are the trade-offs for each. Here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? Or do you have a better solution? Like that exact conversation is what you should be having with your team. So let's try and mimic that in the comments. If you have a slight tweak on my solution that can improve it, would love to hear it. Or if you have a completely different approach, would love to hear that as well. Again, I think a lot of lessons can be learned in the comments. So now that we've made our decision, let's start building it.